For years, the FBI, law enforcement, and even bounty hunters scoured the country for one man. They combed through back alleys, questioned informants, knocked on doors that led to nowhere. Task forces were formed, faces blurred in surveillance tapes, anonymous tips led to dead ends. And yet, he remained just beyond their grasp. His name was printed on wanted posters, broadcast across television screens, whispered in the dimly lit offices of detectives who couldn't shake the feeling that he was close. Closer than anyone dared to believe. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't moving from town to town under cover of darkness. He was right there, at the grocery store, pumping gas at a station you've driven past 100 times, walking down the street in broad daylight, living a life that wasn't his to live. And for years, no one suspected a thing. How does a man erase himself from existence while standing in plain sight? How does someone with blood on his hands become just another face in the crowd? And what happens when the life he's stolen finally catches up to him? This is the story of a man who should have been caught long ago. The story of deception, patience, and a single mistake that unraveled everything. He was America's most wanted man, and he was hiding in plain sight. Every fugitive knows one thing: time is never on their side. The moment they run, the clock starts ticking. Every second is borrowed, every breath is a gamble. Some last weeks, others maybe months. But the man at the center of this story, he outlived them all. He didn't just escape, he erased himself. And in his place, he created someone else. A new name, a new past, a new life. He was wanted in multiple states. His face was plastered across post office walls, shown on late-night crime segments, whispered about in precincts that had long since given up the chase. People knew what he had done. They knew the horror he left behind. But what they didn't know was that he had already become someone else. He walked among them, a neighbor, a co-worker, a stranger in line at a coffee shop. The kind of man who could hold the door open for you in the morning and vanish by nightfall without a trace. The FBI had leads. They had theories. But leads can go cold, and theories are just ghosts in the minds of detectives chasing a shadow. He wasn't just running, he was rewriting reality. And he was good at it. Too good. Years passed, then more. One by one, the investigators turned to different cases, new threats, fresh faces on the wanted list. But somewhere, buried beneath the routine of an ordinary life, he was still out there, watching, waiting. To understand how he got away with it for so long, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the disguises, before the fake identities, before the life he built on top of the one he destroyed. Who was he before he became a ghost? And what did he do that made him run in the first place? This is where the story begins. Before he became a fugitive, before he changed his name, before the entire country was searching for him, he was just a man with a past, a man who walked the same streets as everyone else, who lived, who breathed, who blended in. But beneath the surface, there were cracks, small, almost imperceptible, but they were there. And those cracks, if anyone had noticed them in time, might have changed everything. He had a childhood like everyone else, a family, friends. The details of his early life were unremarkable, ordinary. He went to school, he played sports. He had a mother who loved him, a father who, depending on who you ask, was either strict or something far worse. His teachers described him as quiet, well-mannered, the kind of boy who never made trouble. But quiet doesn't mean harmless. Sometimes it means something else entirely. It means watching, learning, studying the people around you, figuring out what they expect to see, and giving them exactly that. His first brush with the law was small. Petty, barely a footnote, a shoplifting charge at 17, a scuffle outside a bar a few years later. Nothing serious, nothing that screamed danger. If anything, it painted the picture of a man on the edges of trouble but never fully stepping into it. But there was more. Stories that never made it into the official reports. Rumors, whispers, small-town talk that hinted at something underneath the surface. There always is. Something in the way they look at you. Something in the way they smile when no one else is watching. But no one connected the dots back then. And why would they? He wasn't a monster, not yet. He was just a man who knew how to slip through the cracks, how to make people trust him until they didn't. Then something changed. Maybe it was opportunity, maybe it was choice, maybe it was inevitable. But one day he crossed the line, and once he did, there was no going back. What happened next was brutal, messy. The kind of thing that doesn't just land you in trouble. It lands you on the front page of every newspaper in the country. It was the moment his life split in two. The man he used to be, and the ghost he was about to become. The investigation started immediately, a crime that couldn't be ignored, but by the time the police arrived, he was already gone, and the chase had just begun. It happened on a night like any other. Nothing unusual, no warnings, no omens, just another ordinary evening in a town that had no idea what was about to unfold. He had been planning something. For how long? No one knows. Maybe weeks, maybe months. Maybe the thought had been simmering in his mind for years, waiting for the right moment. And that moment had finally arrived. Most crimes are messy, unplanned, spur-of-the-moment decisions fueled by anger, fear, or desperation. But this was different. This wasn't rage boiling over. This wasn't a loss of control. This was something cold, calculated, a decision made long before the first move was ever taken. It was late, past midnight, the kind of quiet that only exists in the deepest hours of the night, when the world is sleeping and the shadows seem just a little bit darker. He knew the routine, knew the way the streetlights flickered outside the window, knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the front door without making a sound. He had studied it, prepared for it, and now it was time. Inside the house there was movement, a rustling of sheets, a muffled cough, someone shifting in bed, unaware that they were no longer alone. What happened next? Only he and the walls of that house will ever truly know. The details in the police report are clinical, detached, a series of cold statements pieced together from evidence left behind. But the truth, the real truth, is buried in the silence between those words, in the moments that weren't recorded, in the breaths held and the final whispers, before everything went still. It was over in minutes, maybe less, maybe more. No one can say for sure. What we do know is that by the time the clock struck 3:17 a.m., the house was quiet again. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint metallic scent in the air, the stillness that lingers when something unnatural has disturbed the night. And he was gone. No forced entry, no witnesses, no immediate signs of struggle, just a crime scene that made one thing clear: whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were doing. By the time the first officer arrived at the house, the crime was already slipping into the past, a moment frozen in time, waiting to be pieced together. But he was already miles away, and if he had planned everything right, no one would ever see him again. For years, he had been a ghost. No traceable phone records, no social security number, no bank accounts, no digital footprint. He was a name that had been scrubbed from the system, a face that only existed in old photographs pinned to corkboards in FBI offices. Leads had dried up, witnesses had forgotten, and the world had moved on. Almost, because somewhere, in a dimly lit room, surrounded by stacks of unsolved cases, there was someone who couldn't let it go. Someone who refused to believe he had disappeared completely. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was obsession, or maybe it was just the feeling that no one can truly vanish without a trace, that somewhere, somehow, he had slipped up. And then, it happened. A flicker of something familiar, a pattern, a detail that had gone unnoticed for years, a missing puzzle piece that had been hiding in plain sight. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, not a sudden phone call, not an anonymous tip, just a single document buried deep within the system, a name that shouldn't have existed, a name attached to an address. And in that moment, the chase began again. He had built a life from nothing, a quiet life, a normal one, a modest house, a steady job, neighbors who waved but never asked too many questions, a routine so ordinary, so painstakingly average that no one ever thought to look closer. And that was the trick, wasn't it? Not to run, not to hide, just to exist, to blend in so perfectly that the idea of guilt became impossible. Because people don't look for monsters in grocery store lines. They don't scan the faces of the men mowing their lawns or walking their dogs. They expect fugitives to be out there, somewhere in the unknown. But he wasn't out there. He was here. He had always been here. The knock came early in the morning. Not the frantic pounding of an imminent arrest, not the aggressive force of a SWAT team storming through the door, but a simple knock. 3 short raps against the wood, calm, controlled, the kind of knock that asks a question rather than demands an answer. And when the door swung open, there he was, standing in the doorway, blinking in the pale morning light, a man who had spent years outrunning the past, now face to face with it. The officer standing there didn't react, not right away, because even with all the evidence, even with all the years spent searching, there was still something surreal about it. The face in front of him was older, slightly heavier, a little more worn, but the eyes were the same, and in that moment they both knew there was nowhere left to run. The arrest was quiet, no shouting, no struggle, just the soft clink of metal against wrists, the slow shuffle of feet down a driveway, the distant murmur of a neighbor peering through their blinds, realizing too late that the man they had borrowed sugar from last week was the same man who had once been at the top of the FBI's most wanted list. And just like that, it was over. The years of running, the years of hiding, the life he had stolen, dismantled in a matter of minutes. But the story doesn't end here, because as he sat in the back of that police car, staring out the window at the life he had built, he did something unexpected. He smiled, just barely, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, as if he knew something they didn't. As if, even in handcuffs, even with everything crashing down around him, he still had one last trick left up his sleeve. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't try to talk his way out of it. No desperate explanations, no half-hearted lies, no panic, just silence. As if this moment had never been in question, as if, deep down, he had always known it would come to this. The officers driving him back to headquarters had expected more, something, anything, a sign of guilt, of fear, of regret. But instead he sat still, calm, looking out the window like a man watching the world pass him by, as if this wasn't the end, but just another chapter in a story only he knew the ending to. Back at the station, they processed him, took his fingerprints, his mugshot, standard procedure. His name, his real name, hadn't been spoken aloud in years. It felt foreign now, unnatural, like something pulled from an old, half-forgotten life. And yet, there it was, printed in bold letters on the report, a name that once meant nothing, now attached to headlines across the country. Word spread fast. The neighbors who had smiled at him in passing, the co-workers who had made small talk with him over coffee, the people who had invited him into their homes, shared meals with him, trusted him, all of them now staring at their screens, trying to make sense of the impossible. How had they not known? How had they not seen it? That was the trick, wasn't it? The greatest disguise isn't a mask. It isn't a fake name or a forged ID. It's normalcy. It's being so unremarkable, so painfully average, that no one ever thinks to look deeper. And that's exactly how he had survived. He hadn't hidden in the shadows. He had hidden in plain sight. The questioning began. The officers were patient, careful. They had spent years chasing him, untangling the crimes, the false leads, the dead ends. And now here he was, sitting across from them, hands cuffed to the table. But if they had expected an easy confession, they were mistaken. "You already know everything," he finally said. His voice was quiet, controlled. "What more do you need?" It wasn't just about what they already knew. It was about what they didn't. Because there were gaps, holes in the timeline, parts of the story that didn't quite fit. They wanted answers. Wanted to know how he had done it, where he had gone, who had helped him, if anyone had. They wanted to know if this was really the end, or if there was more they hadn't uncovered. But he didn't give them what they wanted. He answered questions selectively, offering only what he felt like sharing. Some things he spoke about in detail, almost too much detail, as if reliving the moments in his mind. Other things he dismissed with a shrug, and some questions he ignored entirely, letting them hang in the air, unanswered. A detective's voice growing frustrated. "Where were you between 1998 and 2002? Who helped you?" Silence. A slow smirk. A quiet chuckle. They weren't sure what to make of him. Was he playing a game? Was he taunting them? Or was it something else entirely? Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what someone says, it's what they choose not to. In the days that followed, theories ran wild. Was he truly alone in all this? Or had there been others? People who had known, who had helped, who had kept his secrets? Were there more crimes, more victims, buried beneath the surface of what they had uncovered? Or had he simply outplayed them all, leaving behind a puzzle with just enough missing pieces to keep them guessing forever? And then there was the note. It wasn't much, just a single line scrawled in uneven handwriting on the back of a booking slip. A message left behind in the interrogation room before he was taken away to his cell. 6 words, nothing more. "You only found what I left." It was the kind of message that wasn't meant to give closure. It was meant to do the opposite, to leave questions lingering long after the case was closed, to make people wonder if they had ever truly caught him at all, or just the version of himself he had allowed them to find. And so the case is closed. Or is it? Because even now, years later, there are those who believe there's more to the story, more that we'll never know. What do you think? Was he truly caught, or was this just another trick, another illusion he left behind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more stories of real-life mysteries that defy explanation, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in a world full of secrets, sometimes the scariest ones are hiding right in front of us.